Hi, I'm Barby Asante, and I am an artist and a curator, and I'm based in London. So, wig therapy came. It was a work that kind of came, I suppose, my sort of post college work really. I'd left college and I was, trying to pay off the debt and working and trying to sort of reconcile all the things that I had brought to my work at college. I did a lot of performance work at college, putting myself in the position, playing with my identity, dressing up, doing lots of stuff that would. I kind of worked with anthropological photographs, and so I used to sort of dress up in tribal costumes and try to kind of connect myself to those women or men in those situations, and then I also would kind of juxtapose them with a kind of modern me, and then so I kind of had these, and then I fell pregnant when I was in my final year at college, and I sort of pushed that aside and looked at my body and the kind of action of being pregnant and being a pregnant woman, and how that sort of related to some of those kind of ethnographic and anthropological things that I was looking at. So I was looking, and I also looked at, kind of artworks by people like Mary Kelly, postpartum document. So that was after the baby, but I was really struck by the way she was sort of documenting, the process of this child being, coming into being, really, with his poos and his words and his writing and all of this stuff. But I was thinking about that as a process of happening in my body. So I made work that was called Between a Mother and a Child, and in it I suppose I was really exposed because I mapped my pregnancy, I sort of kept diaries, I made the work all around that, that experience. So that was kind of me, and then that was my degree show. That went off and actually was in an exhibition called Angels and Mechanics that toured into quite a few venues in and around the UK, and I think there was one that might have been in Germany or something. So so that's really quite nice when you've just left college. But I had a child, and I was sort of working, and I found it quite difficult, and I found that work quite exposing. So I wanted to sort of continue to explore that work. I went and did an MA in visual culture. I was working as in community arts as well, and I also, when I was at college, I also used to work in a hairdresser's. So I used to work in a very trendy barber shop, and so wig therapy kind of came out of several influences and sort of thinking about all of those things, thinking about how I was portrayed, what was my position as an artist, where do I want to position myself in the gaze, how do we explore identity when it's not just about me forming the identity, it's about how others form my identity. So I wanted to create a sort of situation in which me as an artist were working with people to look at how you form your identity, using something very playful, using wigs, using the kind of forms that I know from working as a hairdresser, as cutting someone's hair, how intimate it is, using the spaces of hairdressers. So I made the work initially in hairdressers. So I rented a chair and I was there in a working hairdressers while it was happening. So people were having their hair cut and people were having wig therapy at the same time. So that was the original space of doing it. So so this was all kind of enacting at the same time, and so all those sort of intimate conversations that a hairdresser was having with their client, I was having with my client, which was, a wig therapy session. So that's kind of how it came about, and then it sort of morphed into various different kinds of performance situations. We went to Slovenia as part of an international festival of women, and again I did that in a hairdresser's, and I also did that in a performance space, which was really wonderful. But it was completely different, and people are much more exposed. So in what was really interesting, so doing it in the hairdressers, although people were watching it, it was a very intimate situation, and it was billed as therapy. So I became very, very struck by this, this performative engagement, which was much more social, because there was one woman who'd driven over from Croatia, and she was very, very quiet when she was speaking to me, and she talked about how she lost her hair through trauma, through losing somebody, and her hair had fallen out, and she'd actually come for the comfort, the therapy of being involved in this work. Well, on my work at the time, I suppose, if I sort of bring it through college, I mean, I was looking at, definitely looking at Adrian Piper. I was very interested in how she sort of raptures the idea of identity and sort of pushes it and plays with it and disrupts it, and puts people in positions when they're really were really quite confronted by some of the absurd things that they, so absurd assumptions that they make. Interestingly, going back to Slovenia, being in Slovenia, I did actually do an artist talk, but what was really interesting was the artist talk was in the hairdressing school that they had arranged for me to have because I couldn't ship everything over. Plus it was about 9/11, so it was around the time, so you had really restricted baggage anyway. So I just took my wigs, and they got me all the kind of paraphernalia that went with it. And I only ended up speaking to the teachers in this school, and they all sort of were dumbstruck, looking at me, very attentive. It was all being translated into Slovenian. It was being led by the person who had kind of picked me up from the airport, because it was straight after being at the airport. And at the end of the talk, 2 hours later, they all went, "How did you get your hair to be like that?" And they were all very interested in my hair, and at the time I had locks. So it was a really interesting moment where you're kind of going, oh gosh, if this happened in the UK, I would probably want to punch somebody. This is my host country, I've just got off the plane, how do I respond to this? So it became part of the performance, and part of the performance of being there. So I was realising that, okay, this is quite interesting. So, I kind of wheeled something off about how I got my hair to be how to do it. And, they asked could they do it, and I was like, well, no, you don't have the unique hair that I have. And then people just sort of came one by one and had a photograph taken with me. So, there's this kind of indirect artwork, which is this talk I did, and these people's photographs that they've got with the black person that came over. So I'm quite interested in those kind of confrontational things. So there was her, and then I also, but I was also very interested in. I started to become interested in public art, and I think and in engagements, and so I was looking at Alan Caprow and the art of and his idea around the everyday, because I was also very interested in the kind of everyday. And how you kind of incorporate that into your practice, and then also I'd become interested in Suzanne Lacey and Suzanne Lacey's work. So I started to look at the new genre public art. So I was actually quite interested in how you sort of push beyond a kind of object into a much more sort of direct engagements with publics. And so I suppose that also kind of informed the way that I was constructing wig therapy and other subsequent works. Okay, so in terms of audience and wig therapy, and in terms of how I wanted to explore audiences and what audiences were and what audiences do, I suppose I'm quite observant. I was very struck by, I used to work in a gallery, and I was very struck by how quickly I could see people, you know, sort of move by around looking at work. So, you know, they could spend a really long time, and some people could spend not a very long time looking at individual pieces of work, and I was just very curious about the effectiveness of that for my own practice, for what I'm trying to explore. So the idea is, so pulling on those kind of ideas from Capra and, you know, and the new genre public art, and also some of the things that Adrian Piper was doing. You know, if you're sitting on a tube train with a tissue stuffed in your mouth, you know, as part of an artwork, the audience is kind of there, fixed, uncomfortable, trying to sort of figure out what that is. And I was kind of interested in, you know, how do you push that? So when I was thinking about that, I mean, initially the work was, I suppose, these one-to-one pieces, you know, these one-to-one works. And I asked people if they wanted to be filmed. I did have someone there documenting, and they would either be involved or not. Most people actually did want to be filmed, and they and then I also kept my own individual notes, which I made afterwards. So especially for the first sort of series, so I have these quite interesting, you can call them sort of, I suppose, therapist notes, which kind of playfully make conclusions about each person's kind of, I suppose, performance in these wigs. So that was my kind of documentation of that particular kind of that work. And then just to kind of go back to audiences, so I suppose every time that it changed in its permutation, it had different kind of different audiences. But so going back to Slovenia, so when it was in the hairdressers, I had the whole floor to myself, so I didn't have this engagement with the other hairdressers, but I had people were performing because they had an audience, which was quite strange. But then I was in this place where I didn't have the language to kind of to explain this is quite sort of a private piece. And then when you're in a nightclub doing it, you've got a very short sort of space of time. And I think what was really interesting is to be adaptable to places. And I think what I learned quite early on with that is how to be adaptable to places and how to be able to put that work into different contexts. And also how to learn from those different contexts and what those contexts have to offer, because each one does have different things to offer. I mean, I have done it right in the middle of a shopping centre, for example. That has a completely different offer, you know, and that one was also in connection with a company who wanted to promote their wigs. So, you know, that's a really interesting sort of dynamic, because of course that's really beneficial to me to get wigs from this company because they'll sponsor me, but then also they want to promote them, and I'm an artist doing this sort of performance. But I'm always questioning whenever I go into these contexts where these audiences are and how I am. And I suppose in some ways I'm pretty much still performing, even though I decided to reject it. You know, one of the things that also happened when I was doing wig therapy was that I actually also made these interventions into spaces which were just texts that I put up in bars and fashion shops, but in private spaces, like in changing rooms and in toilets, and they were all kind of affirmative statements about identity. And they were sort of, you know, I'd ask the place, and then I'd put the statement up and I left it there. Now, I think what I was interested in there, I was reading a lot Barber, and I was thinking about the eye and the gaze and the position, and I was also thinking about, you know, where we look, maybe where we look at ourselves. And so having this sort of direct engagement with, you know, a very private space, a bathroom, a toilet, a changing room, was something that I was exploring at the same time as I was exploring wig therapy. Just as after wig therapy, I explored the everyday kind of ritual of tea drinking, and I think that I'm also interested in how these everyday experiences are kind of connected to kind of other kinds of experiences. So with the tea, the relationship to imperial past of Britain, and I suppose with the kind of performance of wig therapy and also intervening into the toilets, it's about the relationship of identity and how we construct identities. The South London Black Music Archive came about through, I suppose, a process of me looking at a kind of journey of other projects that I've done, really, because I started probably quite a few years before that, collecting stories from people about music and memory, and that became a work that I made with two works that I made with two different sort of elders groups, really, and they were, one was in South London, which was called Barby's Karaoke, and that was kind of a lovely work with spending a lot of time with this Caribbean community and exploring music and singing and performing and looking at their sort of stories of how they got to the UK through music. And then in Bristol, I worked with a group that I started off from a particular nightclub, which was the first black music nightclub in Bristol, which is called the Bamboo Club. And starting with the proprietor and spending time with the proprietor, sort of expanding that out until I met many members of the club, and then from that I sort of it was a commission by Picture This, and from that I put together this event of bringing like 70 members together, and also kind of collecting their stories and transmitting those into young people, and those sort of became a film piece, a 2-screen film piece that just kind of gave a sense of the club and what's happening at the club and what's happening at the time. So really looking at those some memories. And then I moved back. I was back to London and got a commission with Peckham Space, as they were known at the time. And the group that I was working with was interested in my music work. So we got together, and they were a young people's group, so I worked with them on thinking about music that they'd had passed down to them. And we made a vinyl record, which was called Legacy Tunes. And the young people sort of chose music that was passed down to them, and then music that they would pass on to other people. Pressed 1,000 of those, and they became the first items in this exhibition that I constructed, which was called the South London Black Music Archive. And the point of that archive was to kind of, I suppose, I wanted to expand out the fact that I've had these conversations over a period of time with various people in various ways around music and memory, and to sort of expand that conversation further and create a space where people could deposit items that they could archive that would tell us story about black music in South London. Now, I was really interested in this for a variety of reasons. I wanted to open it up, so I didn't actually just specifically speak to black people. I wanted to think about the relationships of music and place, and think some of the things that were coming up in terms of who had influenced these the previous people that I'd spoken to. So the older people, you know, they talk a lot about country music and how that was relating to, you know, their you know, their musical identity. How I was also thinking about how musicians had kind of appropriated black music, and you know, and also how people, because I was really interested in this not being a kind of musicians thing and being a fans thing. So, you know, there were really wonderful stories that came out about how many babies were made probably by listening to Barry White, for example. You know, how it kind of permeates everybody's life. And then layered on top of that is the kind of position of blackness and how it's actually really perceived in the country and in a place. So it was South London, but you could also pick that up and you could take it to Bristol, and you could take it to Birmingham, and you can still have those conversations. And underneath that, you'd start to get conversations about riots, about the first time people engaged in, you know, saw their first black person, how they kind of connected, how, you know, race relations. And so I'm really interested in it, as well as kind of all the underlying stories that kind of come out. Do I position myself in relation to sort of social art practice? Well, I suppose I do. In that, I mean, I was looking at CatPro, so I was quite interested in that sort of happenings stuff. I also, you know, have been privileged to, as a performer, be part of the troupe of Guillermo Gomez Peña when he's performed in the UK, and I was part of live culture. And yeah, that's probably my most risky kind of performance stuff ever that I've ever done. And you know, Guillermo talks a lot about how you sort of bring your conversation together, and he talks a lot. He was kind of, you know, sort of saying to us, you know, as an artist, you must write your own theory. You must sort of, you know, think about your context, and you know, he's very political in his practice and his work, and you know, in the various places that he's engaging. And I think for me, the social is a really important space. Going back to music, I think, you know, one of the things that made me start to think about using music and memory as a tool to start conversations was to think about the role of music in my own family, and the wonderful what do they call them? I can't remember the big stereo things that we had, and you know, it had drinks in it, and it had everything in it. So all the social was kind of in this radiogram. That's what it's called, a radiogram. And people would come over, and then a lot of the kind of dialogue, I suppose, would happen around that, and that would move from music into politics, into, you know, into films, into all these sorts of things. So I think for me, there is this kind of the social is a really important space in which conversations about things happen, but also the idea of border crossing and borders, and I you know, I had to reflect on working with Guillermo Gomez Peña, because before I met him and I got to work with him through masterclasses, I was reading a lot of his work, and I was very interested in this idea of border crossing. And the idea of border crossing, I suppose, is you know, he's talking about Mexico into America, but then, you know, thinking about my family, that is also crossing borders from, you know, coming from Africa into Europe, into UK, and constantly, I suppose, negotiating different kinds of borders. And so I suppose for me, going into curating is that, again, it's a negotiation of a border as to the position of the artist and the position of the curator, or the, you know, all of that stuff. So, you know, as I'm talking about coming out of the image, you know, particularly if we think about the black body, you know, where that's positioned, taking myself out of that space, and then kind of seeing what happens. And I think, as I said, I feel a bit like a naughty child. I want to see what's beyond. And so curating doesn't seem to be something that I'm not afraid to kind of go into. And it gives me the opportunity to have these dialogues with other artists. It gives me the opportunity to have dialogues with different kinds of material. People mistake the South London Black Music Archive project as, when I'm being introduced, often when I'm talking about it, I'm just introduced as a curator, which is actually quite fine, because there is something, there's very much, I'm really thinking about that form when I'm putting together the archive. But I'm also really thinking about that form, I suppose, when I'm collecting stories and putting them in the mix. You could call it, I'm thinking about, I do DJ from time to time as well. It's like how you pull material together to make it mean something. When I DJ, and I'm thinking, even if I'm thinking about making, it's a party and it's about a crowd, there's a story that I'm telling as I'm doing that. So I'm actually very interested in all of those things that you pull together. And that's how I sort of fell into, I suppose, curating. In particular to Gypsy Land, it was being in a situation where I met Delane Labas, and I was very interested in her background. She's a Romani gypsy, English gypsy, and I was very interested in her work and her working process. And to Gypsy Land really it's a conversation between us as artist curators, although it's led by her work, but also about me having facilitating a kind of spaces for her, because I have the relationship with the galleries and stuff, and so me creating the relationships with the galleries and the spaces to for her to show the work. And we're definitely also working on a very on the ground kind of way, so I've pushed her practice, she's pushed mine, in the sense that I've pushed her into thinking about how she works with people in her practice, and how that informs the way that she's making work. But then also it's pushed mine in the way that I think about diversity and blackness. Because I think with a community like Roma and Gypsy communities, they live so on the edge, we have a tendency to forget about some of the ways in which that community is either maligned, experimented on, excluded and continually excluded. It's actually also reminded me and made me think about how, we get very comfortable in certain positions in certain places. When you're put in places when you're really uncomfortable, when you're put in a position when you have to move all the time, or when your land is being taken away from you, even if you own it, and you're being told that you can't live the way that you want to live. I think it's a very acute kind of area of freedom that we're not necessarily speaking about.
Tell us a little bit about how To Gypsy Land works as a project and how it relates to audiences.
So we're looking at To Gypsy Land as a road trip. So it's a touring exhibition, but what happens in the exhibition is it doesn't actually take the same form in each place. It's really informed by place, so it's informed by wherever we're going, and that can be so for example that can be like being in Scotland, for example, where we were in Glasgow when we first took the show out, where there's a new Roma community that has kind of come to Glasgow and living in the area which is Govan, which is the first place where lots of migrant communities come. So over time they've had Jewish communities, Pakistani community, African communities live there, Roma communities. So it's almost like this space, and also exploring the Scottish relationship to travellers. So the idea that and Scotland, you think of Scotland being quite sort of liberal, but actually, they actually don't recognise that these people actually exist. So mining the place, going around, researching, speaking to people and finding out stories, and then this is all informing the work. So this is, you know, there's like films that are made through having dialogue with people. This has also happened in Peterborough. So in Peterborough, there was a whole issue around contested space. So it was actually around a garden, actually, a garden space. You know, lots of people are reclaiming spaces to make community gardens. Council wants the garden back. This is an issue that always happens to Gypsy communities. There's a place called Dale Farm that they just sort of recently evicted. And, you know, suddenly you're just sort of realising, actually, we're all in a very similar precarious sort of situation where, you know, land and space and public space is being constantly eroded for private, you know, for private gain. So there's lots of conversations that sort of happen, and these are really informing the work. There's lots of conversations between Delane and I that inform our conversations, and we're actually also thinking about we've sort of recently discovered this kind of Afro-Romani community, which is actually mostly around in Los Angeles, I believe. And kind of how are we going to, because we were already talking about America, we were already talking about the kind of connections and the slavery connections between Roma and African communities. It's research. I suppose all of the stuff, the curation and the practice, it's a constant research. It's being curious. That's what's you know, that's what I would say informs my practice, really. Okay, well, I think it probably was around the time that the freestyle exhibition was on, but I don't think I took very much notice of it, really, because you know, I kind of worked in my way, and I was a mum, and although I've got kind of quite an interest in theory, I suppose I didn't really take much notice. However, I think that you know, there's a zeitgeist, isn't there? And there are conversations that you are having with people anyway, regarding sort of notions of blackness, especially when you're a practicing artist, and you know, you're talking to filmmakers and musicians and people that you're all kind of thinking about those sort of different terms, and also the terms of engagement in which you're engaging with your work and with the publics that you're kind of engaging, who are looking at your work, and also the institutions that are you know, either supporting or not supporting your work. So you know, so I suppose it's, for me, it's sort of been something that's reflective, because I didn't really take much notice of it at the time. I think it has its uses. It's useful, but maybe it also really thinks about a particular context and a particular place, and I think it's very possibly, but I think it also possibly negates a lot of different other kinds of contexts. I don't necessarily think that, like, in Britain, I think it's useful maybe to talk about things in terms of aesthetics, or in terms of the ways in which we're pushing aesthetics or trying to think about it. But I think we're always framed within certain institutional structures, even in America. And I also think that we're not post-civil rights. I think there's, you know, some of the ideas that they're talking about, it's like we're post-civil rights. It doesn't mean because you've got a black president in the you know, in the White House, that we're actually post all of these, you know, these actions around race, because actually there's so many sort of very, very massive inequalities that are you know, basically defined around race. And thinking about working on something like to Gypsy Land, you know, I'm starting to kind of really look at, you know, that sort of political blackness, that kind of thing. If you know, we're not over it. I can clearly see that there are still positions that you have to take, the way that you need to negotiate with certain organisations, the way that your work is read. I have also been, you know, I've had my, I mean, as I said, I have a social practice as well, and I have I have had my work read in particular ways that I've had to go back to them and say, actually, maybe you need to look at, you know, these pieces, these writings. Maybe you need to look at Keston. You need to look at some other kinds of writings because it's really framed within particular kind of conversations around race. Well, I think sometimes the kind of I think it's sort of I think with mine it's always been something like, do you frame it? People find it very difficult because, you know, this is quite emerging, these conversations around social practice, and, you know, they find it very difficult to place it, you know, particularly when I kind of present something that, like the South London Black Music Archive, that just kind of lays it down, or, you know, when I'm working with Delane and you say, to Gypsy Land, and, you know, people find it very, very difficult to use the terminology, so, you know, to use the idea of gypsy or the idea of black like it's some sort of exclusion zone, so to speak. You know, it's like something we don't talk about, and, you know, and if you don't talk about it, then or maybe if you're presenting it to somebody, then it's actually exclusive, but actually it's not. For me, the choice of using those two terms are really about stating something and being able to state a conversation, and actually to put something in, just like I was thinking about with I suppose with therapy, is to put something in a frame that says that this constructed identity of blackness, of gypsies, or, you know, all these things are formed in relationship. They're not formed, you know, in some sort of isolated bucket. They're formed in these kinds of conversations. Going back to that, you know, something that is quite useful when you're thinking about post-blackness is the idea that, you know, there is no one singular kind of way, you know, of black, which is, if you think about, which, I mean, should be so entirely obvious when you think about, you know, Africa is not a country. You know, there are many, many forms of, you know, many different kinds of cultures and different ways of thinking that inform Africa, and it's a big place. I mean, even my own personal background, you know, my mother and father are both Akan, but they're different. They're Fanti and Ashanti, and they have these different ways of thinking. So, in a sense, you know, there's a rupture in there that happens because of the way that that was brought forward, you know, brought forward in the children. So, you know, it has its uses. I don't know if it really works in the British context, because I think I was talking to somebody about this recently. The idea, and it was actually around 12 years a slave, and you know, there's been loads of conversation about it being Steve McQueen being British, and you know, who owns the story. Well, often we sort of think, you know, because of things like roots, and that the story becomes an American story. Well, it's not an American story. It's a story that is about a diaspora. And so it's a diasporan story, and it has its roots in various. It has its roots in my family, who are from Fanti and from the coastal areas of Ghana, where there are slave forts, and, you know, it has its roots in Steve's family. It has its roots in you know, sort of lots of Caribbean families. And so I think this idea that where am I going with this? I think this idea that so what was happening with these conversations is that, you know, people are really wrangling about the contested space of this story. You know, who owns this story? Who's kind of has this position on this story? Who has the higher ground on this story? Well, does anybody have that higher ground on the story? They kind of don't, but it's a very important story that kind of talks about where we're at, you know. And in the UK, it's not something that is really acknowledged. It's not something that, you know, the British conversation around slavery, they always talk about how the British were involved in the abolition. Okay. I think in terms of art and the idea of post-black, I think that we're also still behind. And I think that, and why do I think that we're behind? I think it's because I think there's a sort of expectation that you might sort of shed your blackness within the art world somehow. But there's also this kind of thing that maybe you as an artist, you're kind of not shedding it, if you know what I mean. It's something that you live with sort of every day. So I think it does sort of feed into your work. And if we're still living within a structure that makes you know it every day, and of course you do know it. You know it because the differences are being really sort of particularly now in terms of when you hear dialogues around immigration, for example, and how people are speaking about immigrants. It just goes back to those conversations that you heard when I heard as a kid, as a child, in when we were doing the social thing, and they were talking about racism in the 1980s in England, and how the fear of the National Front, or fear of the BNP as it was. So it's still all there, and those conversations that happen in the kind of public realm around immigration, whether they're saying it's this or it's these people or it's this people, it's all there. It's all still very prevalent, and it's still very painful. Now, I don't know how in America you can kind of, like, if it is also, like, right there in your land, how you might forget it. And maybe it is also about the fact that people have migrated north, so maybe they're not necessarily sitting within the land of the South. And I wonder, when I look at someone's work like Kara Walker, I mean, although it's been described as post-black, I wonder if it actually really is, because I think what it brings forward is something that is actually still very, very prevalent, very, very much written in probably in the land of the South. Does the idea of the global or the global contemporary mean anything to me in my art practice? Well, yeah, I think in a sense I perhaps relate more to this idea of the global than I do to the post-blackness, and that is probably because of being from a migrant family. So these shifts that you see in the world around migration and why people migrate, what what causes people to sort of leave places. I'm very, very much connected to those. That's my family story. It's so I often relate to other people who have kind of similar stories as well. That and I suppose in the kind of contemporary art world, when you're thinking about where I sort of maybe see myself placed. I mean, I've been involved in sort of big international performance festivals in Madrid and also in Slovenia, and it's a really exciting platform when you get to speak to other people from different places who have very similar experiences. I'm also quite interested. I recently, was it 2 years ago, I went to the Documenta 13, and it was very interesting because I'm interested in the dialogue. It was interesting to see all the work from these different places and how they kind of had a thread and they were connected. Now, having said that, though, I don't know how that permeates in the UK in terms of the UK recognising artists like myself as being part of that conversation, because we see. And also maybe even in the broader sense as well, because there are a few people that you see sort of kind of in these sort of bigger conversations, but I think sometimes you have to maybe draw on things that are international in order to get that profile, whereas there is actually also really interesting local stuff. So, for example, I'm a real big fan of Wild Shawkey. I think his work is amazing. And you know, his work is shown internationally, but it's actually also really about his local context. But you know, that sort of British local context that we're looking at, it's almost as if it's not interesting to kind of collectors, especially when we're talking about those. But you know, on the other side of it, you know, there are, when you look in the sort of, I don't know, an East London gallery, they're constantly talking about a local context, but it might be that it's also it's kind of marketable work, so you can sort of sell it in particular ways. But then also, I think there is also this kind of move towards African artists, and a more sort of authentic Africanness, rather than a kind of diaspora Africanness. But I do love the actual interesting thing about it. It was just, I have two friends of mine who managed to have slipped themselves into those kind of African spaces, even though one actually was born in Morocco, so he does have, but he has grown up here, and also you know, one that was born here and is from a Caribbean background. So it's actually interesting that they've managed to sort of, they do get taken up on these, and I wonder if it's also about aesthetic forms and the ways in which the work is constructed. If there's I wonder if there's a signification or kind of rules that people are seeing, aesthetic rules that they're looking for, that sort of formulate those things. Having said that, I do think that, you know, when I walked into the Meshack Gabo piece at Tate, I was really struck by how, you know, like lots of friends said to me, it's like walking into something that you would do. So there are kind of, you know, there's conversations, there's things that are happening within that. I mean, you know, he brings together libraries, and he is very curatorial as well in his way of working. And he's also really about working in the local, and he's also about really sort of bringing works into public space. So I'm really interested in Meshack Gabo's, you know, sort of process. So it is quite an interesting thing. But then maybe that also goes back to what we were talking about around post-blackness and the fact that we're not necessarily in those positions. And I wonder, going back to, you know, thinking about the American position, you know, Thelma Golden as a curator, she has got quite a, you know, she's got quite a position. And I think it, you know, we cannot not think about that whole kind of Bourdieu idea about positionality and where we are positioned, and you know, think ideas of privilege, and you know, once you get into sort of certain spaces and what you can influence in certain spaces. And I think you know, I also I teach on a curating course, and you know, none of my students, I mean, I think maybe in the 5 years that I've taught on it, I'd say, you know, of the ethnically diverse students, probably about 2% of those students are ethnically diverse. So, you know, if they're not getting into, and then they're sort of fighting for jobs within these sorts of situations. So if they're not getting into those positions, they're not necessarily getting those voices out there. So it's also about where people are positioned, and you know, what they can do with those things as well. So. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, the idea of, you know, kind of a global curator. They kind of, I suppose they're influence makers. It's almost like the artists are, you know, they're artists that they kind of promote, and they're really interesting artists that kind of come out in these things. But sometimes I suppose the focus is often on the curator. So, you know, you always hear, oh, such and such is doing this, or such and such is doing that. I mean, you know, obviously there are curators that you follow and you think, okay, yeah, they're really interesting. You know that they're going to kind of challenge things, and they're going to put particular artists in, or challenge particular kinds of ways of doing it. And it's almost becomes part of the art world of like looking at, okay, who's doing Documenta, who's doing Venice, what ones are, you know, it becomes part of it. But I think then I wonder if we just lose a bit of focus on the artists, you know, and the kind of works that they're doing, and it becomes informed by, you know, a kind of curatorial concept. One of the things that I work with my students, and I work through a kind of a process of exhibition, and I'm always really conscious to sort of say to them, you know, do you really understand? And maybe this is me being an artist as well. Do you really understand what your artist's work is about? So you're not forming it into your idea, but you're forming it into an idea that actually also has the integrity of the artist's work within it. So you're having a kind of two-way dialogue. I'm really interested in those sort of two-way dialogues. And some of these curators are very successful in doing that, and some of them are not. You know, so it just really depends on those things. I mean, having said that, you are always interested to kind of go to these things, to see these things, to look at the work and how it's kind of being contextualised and portrayed. I wonder if it will ever stop. You know, I wonder if it will be. I wonder if what it will be like, because I've spoken to a few sort of smaller organisations who are thinking about things like having, what do they call them, like, you know, artist associates who might work with to sort of put on exhibitions for the artists, to bring in people that they know, to have dialogue, for the artists to have dialogue. And I wonder about that model. I wonder whether that model might one day, I mean, I know you can see it in some places, be kind of adopted, because I'm sure, I mean, artists, they have dialogues with each other all the time. You know, they can see those connections between the works that they're making. So I think that would be very interesting to see whether that might be something that happens in the future.